In a few days' time, we get to watch iconic Warner Brothers / DC characters Superman and Batman butt heads in Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice, the worst titled superhero film in recent memory. How does it look? Hell if I know. They've released 4 trailers for this thing, only 3 of which I've actually seen, and only one of them has managed to make it look mildly promising. I think it was the Comic-Con one. But the cast looks decent, Affleck looks really cool as Bruce Wayne, the Enterprise at least looks narratively promising. Yes, even after all that, there is still a deep part within me that wants to see these two guys meet up on the big screen, and look, the camera operator's clearly using a tripod this time round, so it should be watchable. In the wake of its release, however, I can expect that we're going to be seeing a lot of analyses, be it in online articles or videos, re-evaluating Man of Steel, its absurdly difficult to watch predecessor that we've already discussed in a couple of videos beforehand, and retroactively arguing its quality now that we know that Dawn of Justice is currently seeking to act as some kind of feature-length apology for everything in that first movie, and will seemingly attempt to rectify most of the controversy it mustered up. Oh god, I can see it now, the plethora of fanboys and girls hurrying back to finally prove me wrong about every flaw in Man of Steel being, like, a plot point totally planned to be paid off in the sequel. Me, on the other hand, shan't be doing that. Or rather, I won't be looking back at what remains, no word of a lie, the worst cinematic experience I've ever had, with any kind of rose-tinted perspective or newfound appreciation for it, even if Dawn of Justice turns out to suddenly make Man of Steel look really good. One thing that has me a bit more hopeful this time round, however, is what we've seen of Superman so far in the trailers, though we won't know for sure till we see the full thing. Which brings to mind something that I've been wanting to discuss for a while now, specifically in relation to just what the mentality was behind Man of Steel when Zack Snyder and company pursued it a few years ago. You know, there was a really interesting fan-funded documentary released last year by John Schnepp called The Death of Superman Lives: What Happened, which chronicled the ongoings behind the scenes of Tim Burton's Superman movie project from the late 90s that never went past pre-production, and which saw many filmmakers, artists and writers come together to tell stories and bring to light a lot of info about the never-released movie. Moving away from the 70s optimism of Richard Donner's science fiction melodrama and into the deepest corners of ultraviolet dark age fantasy, the movie would have seen Burton and company completely revamp the character. It was to be a radical reinterpretation loosely based on the Death of Superman comic arc released a few years prior, and was intended to take Superman into a brand new place he'd never been before, similar to that of Burton's Batman in '89. And no, your eyes do not deceive you, that is indeed Nicolas Cage in costume fittings for the role of the new Man of Tomorrow. While I think the movie itself would have ultimately failed for reasons we'll get to, it's a fascinating documentary that gives a lot of insight into the studio and just how movies get started, and as someone who loves ridiculous sounding sci-fi fantasies, I had a blast listening to all these guys talk about their absolutely wild concepts for this movie, and it's great to see so much artwork finally come to surface because of it. One notably interesting thing to pick up on from the documentary, however, is how when many members of the crew discuss their experiences and ideas, very little said is about any actual story. Or one definitive story at least. No one really sounds excited over what the main overarching narrative or character potentials could have been for this new Superman, as much as how eager they all were to see Burton step in to visually and aesthetically reinvent the iconic hero. So the film wasn't so much spearheaded from the perspective of how can we pursue a reverent new take on the original character. In fact, the sheer amount of embarrassment present within these people's voices when discussing the source material causes me to doubt any of them even put in the time to actually read up on it, but more, how can we fix him? How can we get rid of the red underwear? How can we redesign his suit to, and I'm quoting John Peters, the producer here, look less faggy? Essentially, this was going to be the movie that supposedly finally made Superman cool. Or at least a 12-year-old angst-ridden teenager's idea of what a cool Superman should look like, with darker exterior attributes and a much edgier looking suit. That mentality, I think, leads to a slightly more worrying undercurrent that, as well-intentioned as I'm sure they all may have been, most folks involved in the making of the movie, it would seem, bar a select few, didn't actually like Superman, and their intentions stem not so much from a fondness for the material, but a failure to connect with it, which would likely have been a problem since projects like these tend to only go well if there's some kind of affection for the source. These guys weren't just going to reinterpret Superman. If that was it, I don't think anyone would have had a problem with it. They were going to fundamentally bend him over backwards to try and make him more appealing to a modern audience. Which is a mindset I've never really managed to sympathise with, considering if you actually go and do your homework, you'll know there are tons of compelling stories about the more traditional character that, if done well on screen, would most likely garner a positive reception and prove naysayers wrong. People tend not to go beyond the first page because, if the suit doesn't turn them off, the character being overpowered and therefore hard to relate to apparently does, but still, that's not really Superman's thing anyway, and I don't understand why so many people feel it needs to be. All-Star Superman? That story gave him even more abilities just to emphasize how power is not what defines him, but rather his ability to better the human race by examples of good, and how remaining that way when the world around you so frequently isn't is his biggest battle. Seriously, filmmakers, if you solely judge Superman based on the red underwear on the outside of his pants, because for some stupid reason it makes you go, ha! Gay! You don't understand the character, and you never did. The scary part of all that? Warner Brothers really were going to let these guys make this movie. Now, keep in mind, this was also a time when they were allowing Schumacher and company to put out travesties like Batman and Robin, another project shamelessly pandering to demographics that had previously proven successful, so you could just chalk it up to simply the studio having seen better days. In fact, failures like such inspired the cancellation of Superman Lives altogether. But that aforementioned producer we just mentioned, John Peters, the guy that wanted Superman to look less faggy, is still producing Superman movies, one of which being Man of Steel. Yeah, things are starting to add up now, right? Fast forward to after the one filmmaker besides Richard Donner that actually did seem to take an interest in the character didn't quite manage to bring him wholly back to life, and in 2013, Man of Steel, the Zack Snyder directed, Christopher Nolan produced, David Goyer written reboot, did indeed become that Superman movie that Lives was trying to be, albeit in a different form. A shockingly wrong-headed attempt to alter a character not many people at the studio particularly cared about, for a niche audience that didn't like him either. And so instead of feeling like the refreshing, modernistic, or inspired adaptation of the iconic hero for modern times like we all thought it'd be, felt more like some kind of bizarre inverse of what it should have been. A product which felt as if it only could have spawned from that time-lost decade in comics when writers would introduce the hip, darker, edgier versions of certain superheroes as a way of shamelessly pandering to a demographic, mostly consisting of prepubescent boys that desperately wanted to feel as if they were reading grown-up stuff for adults, that didn't actually get the characters, yet would still constantly demand that the broadest, shallowest alterations be applied to them, even if those changes were self-defeating. So in similar fashion as turning the socially awkward, relatable teenager into a sexy, smouldering power fantasy, Man of Steel took the guy who literally stood for truth, justice, and the American way, who be held to a strict code of ethics and who remained optimistic for a better future in society, and saw him foolishly leveling a city for the sake of a fight, becoming an unsure of himself brute with questionable morals and ultimately nothing to say, and even killing the bad guy right at the end. Sure, you can turn to the god-awful camera work, the terrible surface-level script, the trailer-made dialogue, the pseudo-spiritual nonsense, the mean-spirited and grim aesthetic, and so forth, but the real problem that underlies and informs them all is that Man of Steel wasn't made to tell a new story or to do anything interesting with the character, but solely to revise Superman for a generation that didn't like him. That mentality might have been excusable back in 1997, considering comic books at the time were still occupying that very same headspace, but in a time after Marvel had already adapted Captain America to the big screen without a hint of irony or embarrassment and with all of his Boy Scout optimism intact, it just felt like a failure to get with the times. But that is exactly what happened. Superman lost the red underwear to look less campy, his suit was muted way down to look darker and more serious, his ethics were made questionable to make him more relatable, and in response to a common Superman Returns criticism, his fights with the villains became these huge sweeping action spectacles. None of that stuff is inherently bad on its own, I'm sure it's entirely possible to make a compelling narrative out of all that, but another huge problem Man of Steel had was that instead of actually making these changes work well in the context of a story, all the movie did was simply prove that these things now existed. The whole movie was just a statement, a checklist of character revisions inserted into 2 hours and 20 minutes, and then loosely strung together to give the illusion of a narrative without having any actual points to make or any story to tell. It's like proving you can make a sandwich look appealing without any attempts to make it actually taste good. An example I keep coming back to is the death of Zod. They could have had Superman doubt himself and then kill the bad guy at the end of the movie if there was any kind of interest in making it work well in the actual script, but there wasn't. Heck, the story about how and why David Goyer shoehorned that part into the film without rhyme or reason beyond "it'd be a cool thing to see" says it all. Whereas had the filmmakers actually been interested in making that work well besides an attention-getting bit that non-fans could cite as the moment the Boy Scout was out and their preferred darker version had arrived, where perhaps it had been an integral thematic focus in the narrative, there had been some foreshadowing leading to Superman's decision to do it, and then maybe a scene actually addressing his moral ambiguity after the fact, yeah, you totally could have set the stage for a different kind of compelling version of this realistic Superman people kept asking for. One who questions his actions, and who had to experience killing before realizing it's something that he should never do. But that's the thing. There's the finished film, there's Superman killing Zod, and there's the following scene where everyone acts all chipper as if it just never happened. They weren't interested in doing or saying anything with it. It was just another pandering box-checking scene to desperately try and move further away from the original character. which I'm sure Batman v Superman will pretend was actually some kind of pre-planned narrative arc long in the making. I don't know if there's an overarching point I'm trying to make here in relation to Dawn of Justice, but if the overall decision making for projects concerning this character tells us anything about this particular studio and these particular filmmakers, it's that these guys are long overdue a growth spurt in their approach to these kinds of properties, and I hope that Dawn of Justice finally shows them grasping their own material, being proud of it, and actually trying to make a good movie out of it. Because if it really is Warner Brothers' plan to build a vast cinematic universe of characters ranging from a whole bunch of different worlds, integrity and fidelity for the source, as well as good filmmaking, is going to be a huge part of making it work. Not just trying as hard as you can to make each and every character not camp anymore. Yes, I'm looking at you, Aquaman. Cheers for watching, guys, and as always, if you like this video, you can subscribe to my channel.